What if the one thing standing between you and an extraordinary life isn't your circumstances, your resources, or even your talent, but the fragility of your own mind? What if every time life got hard, every time failure knocked at your door, every time pressure built to an unbearable level, your mind folded, retreated, and handed victory over to everything working against you? And what if, starting today, that could change forever? This audiobook is about building a mind so strong, so resilient, and so deeply conditioned to thrive under pressure that no challenge, no loss, no setback, and no storm can break you. Not because life will get easier, but because you will get harder. The secret to becoming mentally unbreakable isn't a single moment of courage. It isn't one motivational speech or one difficult experience. It is a daily practice, a series of deliberate choices, mental disciplines, and psychological strategies that, over time, forge a mind that bends but never breaks. By the time you finish this audiobook, you will not just understand what mental toughness is. You will know exactly how to build it, maintain it, and use it to dominate every area of your life. Let's begin. Chapter 1. What mental toughness really is. Most people have completely the wrong idea about mental toughness. They picture a soldier charging through enemy fire with no emotion on his face. They imagine an athlete who never cries, never doubts, never feels the weight of the moment pressing down on them. They associate mental toughness with a kind of coldness, a robotic immunity to pain and emotion. And because of that misunderstanding, most people never develop it, because they are chasing a version of strength that doesn't exist. Here is the truth that will change how you approach everything that follows in this audiobook. Mental toughness is not the absence of emotion. It is not the elimination of fear, doubt, pain, or uncertainty. Mental toughness is the ability to continue moving forward, despite the presence of all of those things at once. It is not about feeling nothing. It is about feeling everything and still choosing action. That distinction is not a minor one. It is the entire foundation on which a bulletproof mindset is built. Think about the people you have admired most in your life, the ones who seem to be made of a different material than everyone else around them. The leader who stayed calm while the organization was burning down around her. The athlete who hit the game-winning shot after missing 10 in a row. The entrepreneur who launched a new company 6 months after his last one collapsed. Did those people feel nothing? Did they wake up each morning untouched by doubt or fear? Absolutely not. What separated them from the people who crumbled under similar pressure was not that they felt less. It was that they had trained themselves to act in spite of what they felt. They had built an internal system that allowed emotion to exist without giving it decision-making authority over their lives. Research in performance psychology consistently shows that the highest performers across every field, sports, business, medicine, military, the arts, are not people who are free from emotional experience. They are people who have learned what psychologists call emotional regulation, the ability to acknowledge what you feel, process it without being consumed by it, and redirect your energy toward purposeful action. This is not suppression. Suppression, pushing emotions down and refusing to acknowledge them, actually backfires. It depletes mental energy and eventually causes an emotional explosion at the worst possible time. True mental toughness is something entirely different. It is acknowledgement without surrender. There is another myth about mental toughness that must be dismantled before you can begin to build it. Most people believe that mental toughness is something you either have or you don't. A fixed trait you were born with or unlucky enough to be born without. This belief is not just wrong, it is dangerous, because the moment you accept that mental toughness is a trait rather than a skill, you stop doing the work required to develop it. You stand at the edge of every hard moment and tell yourself that you simply aren't built for it. And then you retreat. And then the world confirms what you believed about yourself all along. But neuroscience tells us a radically different story. The brain is not a fixed machine. It is a living, adaptive organ that physically rewires itself in response to experience. When you repeatedly expose yourself to discomfort and push through it, you are not just building psychological resilience in a metaphorical sense. You are literally strengthening neural pathways, thickening the connections between your prefrontal cortex, which governs rational decision-making and emotional control, and your amygdala, the brain's alarm system. The more frequently you practice operating under pressure, the less reactive your amygdala becomes, and the more control your prefrontal cortex retains in high-stress moments. This is not a metaphor. This is biology. And it means that every single person listening to this right now has the capacity to become mentally stronger than they are today. So if mental toughness is not emotional numbness and not a fixed trait, what is it exactly? At its core, mental toughness is a set of practiced habits, thought patterns, and behavioral responses that create consistency in the face of adversity. It is the ability to stay committed to your goals when motivation disappears. It is the ability to absorb failure, extract the lesson, and return to the arena without losing your identity. It is the ability to delay gratification, resist distraction, and endure discomfort for the sake of something greater than the comfort of the present moment. And it is built the same way every other skill in your life is built, through repetition, intention, and time. There is one more thing you need to understand about mental toughness before this audiobook can take you where it is designed to take you. Mental toughness is not a destination. It is a practice. There is no point at which you arrive and declare yourself permanently unbreakable. The mentally tough are not people who have crossed some finish line beyond which life can no longer hurt them. They are people who have committed to a daily relationship with difficulty. They seek it out. They choose it before it chooses them. They understand that the mind, like a muscle, can only maintain its strength through consistent use. And they have made peace with the fact that growth and comfort cannot coexist, that peace is not weakness, that peace is the beginning of everything. Chapter 2. The Neuroscience of an Unbreakable Mind. Your brain is not designed for mental toughness. Let that sink in for a moment before you assume it is working against you. The human brain evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in an environment where the primary threats to survival were physical predators, starvation, exposure, injury, death. In that environment, the brain developed a powerful and deeply efficient threat detection system whose sole purpose was to identify danger and mobilize the body to respond to it as fast as possible. That system doesn't think. It reacts. It doesn't weigh options. It screams. And for our ancestors, living under constant physical threat, that system was not just useful. It was the difference between life and extinction. but you are not living in the African savanna 70,000 years ago. You are living in a world where the threats are psychological, social, and professional. Rejection, failure, criticism, uncertainty, public embarrassment, financial loss, and your brain operating on hardware that hasn't fundamentally changed since the Pleistocene responds to those psychological threats with the same survival programming it developed for physical danger. It floods your body with cortisol and adrenaline. It narrows your thinking. It makes you hyper-focused on escape rather than solution. It screams at you to retreat, to quit, to avoid, to hide. And when you listen to it, when you let that ancient alarm system make your modern decisions, you remain permanently trapped inside your own biology. Understanding this is not an excuse, it is a map. Because once you understand why your brain defaults to fear and avoidance under pressure, you can begin the deliberate work of overriding those defaults and installing new ones. That process begins with understanding 3 critical brain structures and the roles they play in either creating or dismantling mental toughness. The first is the amygdala. Located deep in the temporal lobe, the amygdala is your brain's threat detection center. It processes incoming information from your environment before your conscious mind even has a chance to evaluate it. When it detects what it interprets as danger, whether that danger is a tiger or a difficult conversation with your boss, it triggers the fight or flight response in milliseconds. Heart rate accelerates, muscles tense. Blood flow is redirected from the thinking parts of your brain toward the parts responsible for physical action. This is what researchers call an amygdala hijack, a moment in which the emotional brain takes complete control of your behavior before the rational brain can weigh in. If you have ever said something you immediately regretted in the heat of an argument, or frozen completely under pressure when you needed to perform, or abandoned a goal the moment it started to feel hard, you have experienced an amygdala hijack firsthand. The second structure is the prefrontal cortex. This is the part of your brain located just behind your forehead, and it is the seat of everything we associate with higher human function, rational thinking, long-term planning, impulse control, emotional regulation, and complex decision-making. It is, in a very real sense, the part of your brain responsible for mental toughness. When your prefrontal cortex is online and functioning properly, you can feel fear without being controlled by it. You can recognize that a situation is difficult without catastrophizing. You can make decisions based on your values and your goals rather than on your immediate emotional state. The problem is that the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex are in constant competition. And when stress levels are high, the amygdala wins. Every time. Unless you have trained it not to. The third structure is the anterior cingulate cortex, a region that acts as a kind of bridge between your emotional brain and your rational brain. Research, published in journals of cognitive neuroscience, has shown that people who demonstrate higher levels of mental resilience tend to have stronger activation and greater structural density in the anterior cingulate cortex. This region helps regulate the conflict between what you feel and what you know, allowing you to hold emotional discomfort in awareness without being swept away by it. And here is the remarkable part. This structure, like every other part of the brain, can be developed. It physically grows stronger with practice. With repeated exposure to stress that is managed and moved through rather than avoided, the anterior cingulate cortex becomes more robust, more efficient, and more capable of maintaining the bridge between emotion and reason under pressure. So what does all of this mean for you in practical terms? It means that every time you choose to remain engaged with difficulty instead of escaping it, you are doing neurological training. Every cold shower you take when your body is screaming for warmth, every hard conversation you push yourself to have when avoidance feels so much easier, every workout you complete when your mind insists you've done enough, every moment of boredom you sit through without reaching for your phone, every failure you allow yourself to feel, examine, and learn from instead of burying under distraction, all of it is reshaping your brain at the cellular level. All of it is literally building the neurological architecture of mental toughness. There is also a critical neurochemical dimension to this conversation. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter most associated with reward and motivation, plays a crucial role in mental resilience. Most people think of dopamine as the brain's pleasure chemical, the thing released when something good happens to you. But that is an oversimplification. Research from neuroscientists at institutions, including Stanford University, has shown that dopamine is more accurately understood as the brain's anticipation chemical. It is released not primarily in response to reward, but in response to the pursuit of reward, especially when that pursuit involves difficulty and uncertainty. What this means is that your brain is designed to feel energized and motivated by challenge, not comfort. When you avoid difficulty, you are not protecting your mental energy. You are draining it. You are depriving your dopamine system of the very thing it is wired to respond to. The momentary relief of avoidance comes at the cost of long-term vitality. The mentally unbreakable understand this intuitively. They have learned that the feeling of aliveness, of genuine engagement with life, comes not from making things easier, but from making themselves more capable of handling hard things. This is your brain's potential. This is what is available to you, not through luck or genetics, but through deliberate, daily, consistent practice. The chapters that follow will show you exactly what that practice looks like. Chapter 3. The Morning Ritual of the Mentally Bulletproof. The first hour of your morning is the most important hour of your day. Not because of what happens externally during that hour, but because of what happens internally. The mental state you inhabit when you first open your eyes, the thoughts you allow in, the habits you execute, the tone you set for your nervous system before the world gets its hands on you determines your psychological foundation for everything that follows. The mentally bulletproof understand this at a bone-deep level. They do not stumble into their days. They build them deliberately and without apology from the very first moment of consciousness. Let's be brutally honest about what most people do in the first hour of their morning. The alarm goes off, and the hand reaches sometimes before consciousness has even fully arrived for the phone. Within 60 seconds of waking, the mind that should be its own sovereign territory is already flooded with someone else's agenda. Email notifications pulling at your sense of responsibility. News headlines, engineering, anxiety. Social media comparisons quietly eroding your sense of worth. The dopamine loop starts immediately. And it is not the kind of dopamine loop that builds strength. It is the kind that creates dependency. And then you wonder why, by 10 in the morning, you already feel overwhelmed, reactive, and scattered. The answer begins in that first hour you surrendered without a fight. The mentally bulletproof protect their morning with a ferocity that might look extreme to people on the outside. But it is not extreme. It is strategic. They understand that the brain operates in a specific neurological state immediately after waking, a state that neuroscientists call the hypnopompic state, a transitional period during which the brain moves from deep sleep toward full wakefulness. During this window, brainwave activity shifts from the deep theta waves of sleep toward the alpha waves of relaxed awareness. This is a period of extraordinary mental receptivity, a window during which the suggestions you give your mind, the intentions you set, and the beliefs you affirm are absorbed with unusual depth and efficiency. It is not an accident that every high performer, every resilient individual, every person who seems to operate from a place of unshakable internal stability has developed a morning ritual that takes deliberate advantage of this window. The first element of the bulletproof morning is intention. Before the phone, before the news, before any external input whatsoever, the mentally tough begin their day by choosing the mental state they intend to inhabit. This is not a vague hope. It is an active, conscious decision. Some people journal. Some speak their intentions aloud. Some simply hold them in silence for 5 minutes before rising. The format is less important than the function. The function is to remind the mind what it is working toward today, not the to-do list, not the calendar, not the meetings, the deeper why, the values, the identity, the kind of person you are choosing to be today, regardless of what the day throws at you. This act of daily intention setting is one of the most consistent distinguishing habits found across studies on high-resilience individuals. It doesn't just feel good. It neurologically primes the prefrontal cortex for leadership of the day rather than reactive followership. The second element is physical activation. The evidence here is overwhelming, and it points in one unmistakable direction. The body and mind are not separate systems. They are one system, and what you do to one, you do to the other. Morning movement, whether it is a full training session, a brisk walk, a series of calisthenics, or even 10 minutes of yoga, creates an immediate cascade of neurochemical changes that directly enhance mental toughness. Cortisol, which is naturally elevated upon waking as part of your body's alerting mechanism, is metabolized and processed through physical movement, rather than being left to circulate in your system and generate anxiety. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor, often described by neuroscientists as miracle grow for the brain, is released during aerobic activity, enhancing cognitive function, improving mood stability, and increasing the brain's capacity for adaptive thinking, the kind of thinking you need to navigate difficulty with intelligence rather than panic. The mentally bulletproof do not wait until they feel like moving. They move, and then they feel, because they have learned that motivation follows action, not the other way around. The third element is deliberate discomfort. This is the one that most separates the mentally strong from the merely motivated. Every morning, before the day gets comfortable, the bulletproof mindset practitioner does something hard on purpose, something small, something controlled, but something that requires overriding the preference for ease. For many, this takes the form of cold exposure, finishing a warm shower with 60 to 90 seconds of cold water at the lowest temperature the tap will deliver. This is not a wellness trend. It is a daily training session for the part of your brain that is responsible for emotional regulation. When ice-cold water hits your body, your amygdala fires immediately. The primal response is urgent and overwhelming. Every biological signal screams to escape, to turn the tap to warm, to end the discomfort now. When you choose not to, when you breathe into the cold and remain still in the middle of that discomfort, you are winning a small but profoundly significant battle against the reactive part of your brain. And you are winning it before 8 in the morning. That victory compounds. It sends a message into your nervous system that carries through every difficult moment that follows in the day. I have already proven today that I can face what is uncomfortable. I can handle hard things. The cold is a symbol, but symbols are powerful. What matters is that every morning you find your version of the hard thing and you do it anyway. The fourth element is silence. In a world engineered for constant stimulation, silence has become a radical act. The mentally bulletproof created every morning without exception. Not the silence of waiting, the silence of presence. 10 minutes of stillness in which the mind is allowed to settle, integrate, and hear itself think. This is the window in which creative solutions emerge, in which the noise of anxiety is distinguished from genuine intuition, and in which the emotional residue of yesterday is metabolized before it carries forward into today. Meditation, breathwork, prayer, or simply sitting in stillness with nothing to do and nowhere to be the practice varies, but the purpose is consistent. You cannot hear your own inner voice in the constant roar of external input. And the inner voice, the one that knows your values, your direction, and what you actually need, is your most powerful navigational tool. The morning ritual of the mentally bulletproof is, at its heart, an act of reclamation. It is the daily choice to take back ownership of your mind before the world gets the chance to colonize it. Chapter 4. How to weaponize pain and discomfort. Pain is the most misunderstood force in human development. Almost every person alive is engaged in a lifelong project of avoiding it, minimizing it, numbing it, and escaping it. And the entire industry of comfort, from the entertainment that keeps you endlessly distracted to the substances that dull the edge of difficult feelings, to the culture of ease and convenience that has systematically removed every friction point from modern life, is built to service that avoidance project. The problem is not that pain is pleasant. It isn't. The problem is that avoidance of pain comes at a cost that most people never calculate until it is far too late. And that cost is everything. Your potential, your character, your freedom, your life. Here is what the mentally bulletproof know about pain: that most people spend their entire lives trying not to confront. Pain is information. It is not punishment. It is not evidence that something has gone wrong with the universe. It is not a signal that you should stop or retreat or reassess whether any of this was a good idea. Pain is data, and like all data, the appropriate response is not to delete it or ignore it or flinch from it, but to read it, understand it, and use it. The mentally unbreakable have learned to ask a different question when pain arrives. Not why is this happening to me, which is a question that leads nowhere except self-pity. But what is this telling me, which is a question that opens every door. Let's talk about the two categories of pain that every person who aspires to mental toughness must learn to distinguish between, because confusing them is one of the most common and most costly mistakes on the road to resilience. The first category is signal pain, the kind that is genuinely warning you of danger, damage, or a boundary that must not be crossed, an injury that worsens with continued effort. A relationship dynamic that is genuinely harmful to your well-being. A work environment that is destroying your health. Signal pain is real, it is valid, and it must be listened to. Ignoring signal pain is not mental toughness. It is recklessness, dressed up as strength, and it leads to damage that takes far longer to recover from than the discomfort you are trying to push through. The second category is growth pain, and this is where most of the work of mental toughness happens. Growth pain is the discomfort of expansion. It is the burning of muscles under load. It is the anxiety of attempting something before you are certain of the outcome. It is the vulnerability of speaking your truth in a room that might not receive it well. It is the frustration of learning a new skill slowly, without grace, without the competence you wish you already had. It is the loneliness that sometimes accompanies the decision to pursue a life that diverges from what those around you have chosen. Growth pain does not mean you are breaking. It means you are becoming. And until you learn to recognize it for what it is and move toward it rather than away from it, you will spend your entire life in the comfortable vicinity of who you already are, never crossing the border into who you could be. The process of weaponizing pain begins with reframing. Not in the watered-down, motivational poster sense of pretending pain isn't pain, but in the deeply practical, neurologically grounded sense of changing what pain means to you, because meaning is everything. Research by psychologist Kelly McGonigal and her colleagues has demonstrated that the relationship between stress and harm is not fixed. It is dependent on belief. People who believe that stress is harmful to them experience measurably worse physiological and psychological outcomes from stressful situations than people who believe stress is a signal that the body is preparing to rise to a challenge. The stress itself, the cortisol, the accelerated heart rate, the heightened arousal, is the same. The body's response to the meaning assigned to that stress is radically different. This means that the narrative you carry about difficulty, about pressure, about pain, is not a passive reflection of reality. It is an active participant in creating it. The mentally bulletproof have rewritten their internal narrative about pain at the deepest level. When discomfort arises in the gym, in the boardroom, in the middle of a conflict, in the dark hours of doubt and uncertainty, they do not experience it as an intruder to be expelled. They experience it as a familiar companion, a signal that they are in the territory where growth happens. They have developed what researchers call a pain tolerance threshold that is not fixed but is continually being expanded through practice. And that expansion happens through progressive exposure, the deliberate, consistent practice of seeking out controlled doses of difficulty and moving through them rather than around them. Progressive exposure looks different for every person, but the principle is universal. You begin where you are. You find the thing that is slightly beyond what is comfortable, slightly beyond what feels safe, easy, or guaranteed. And you do that thing, not all the way to the edge of what you can't handle, not reckless overextension that invites signal pain, but to the edge of what stretches you without breaking you. And then you rest, and then you return, and you find that the edge has moved. What was once the outer limit of your capacity has become your baseline. What once required everything you had now requires a fraction. And you step out to the new edge, and you do it again. This is how human beings grow. This is how muscle fibers develop. This is how psychological resilience is built. Not in dramatic, cinematic moments of transformation, in small, consistent, daily encounters with the thing that is slightly harder than yesterday. One of the most powerful practices you can develop in the weaponization of pain is the deliberate choice to sit with discomfort without acting on it. Modern life offers an escape hatch from virtually every uncomfortable feeling, and most people use those escape hatches constantly without even realizing they are doing it. Uncomfortable silence in a conversation reach for the phone. Anxiety about an uncertain outcome distract with entertainment. Frustration with slow progress abandon the project and start something new. Sadness or grief numb with food, alcohol, or endless social media scrolling. Every time you use the escape hatch, you are telling your nervous system that discomfort is intolerable, that it must be escaped immediately and at any cost. And your nervous system believes you, and it becomes increasingly unwilling to sit in discomfort for even a moment without screaming for exit. The practice of sitting with discomfort, feeling the feeling fully, without acting on it, without judging it, without running, is one of the most transformative habits a human being can develop, because it teaches the nervous system the single most liberating truth available: this feeling will pass. I can handle it. It is not going to kill me. And on the other side of it, I am still here. Chapter 5. Silencing the enemy within. There is a voice in your head. You know the one. It is there when you set the alarm for 5 in the morning and then reason yourself back to sleep at 4:59. It is there the moment you think about starting the business. The conversation, the chapter, the workout, the difficult change, that cold, immediate whisper that says, not yet, not you, not now. It is there when things go wrong, amplifying every mistake into evidence of your fundamental inadequacy. It is there when things go right, warning you that it won't last, that you don't deserve it, that the other shoe is about to drop. That voice is not your truth. It is not your instinct. It is not the voice of wisdom or care or discernment. It is the voice of your threat detection system, dressed up in the language of reason. And it is the single most powerful obstacle between you and an unbreakable mind. Psychologists refer to the content of this inner voice as automatic negative thoughts, cognitive patterns that arise spontaneously, feel entirely believable, and are almost never subjected to scrutiny. They arrive with the authority of facts, though they are almost always something far less reliable. Interpretations, predictions, catastrophic extrapolations built from past pain and projected onto a future that hasn't happened yet. The mentally unbreakable are not people who have silenced this voice completely. No human being has. What they have done is something more achievable and far more powerful. They have learned to stop confusing the voice with reality. The relationship between thought and identity is one of the most critical and most misunderstood aspects of mental resilience. Most people have never been taught that there is a difference between the voice in their head and the self that is listening to it. They experience every thought as a personal statement, as something that is fundamentally and unquestionably true about who they are. The thought "you're not good enough" doesn't feel like a thought. It feels like a verdict. The thought "this is impossible" doesn't feel like an interpretation. It feels like a fact reported from an objective observer. And as long as you are fused to your thoughts in this way, unable to step back and observe them with any distance, they will run your life. Not because they are correct, but because you have never learned to question them. The first skill of silencing the enemy within is diffusion, the cognitive ability to separate yourself from your thoughts and observe them as mental events rather than as reality. This is a practice drawn from acceptance and commitment therapy, one of the most evidence-supported frameworks in contemporary psychology, and it works because it fundamentally shifts the power dynamic between you and the voice in your head. When you learn to observe a thought rather than simply having it, everything changes. Instead of "I am a failure," you learn to think "I am noticing the thought that I am a failure." Instead of "this is impossible," you observe "I am having the thought that this is impossible." That linguistic shift, small as it sounds, creates an enormous amount of psychological space. It reminds you that the thought is a product of your mind, not a report from the external world. And with that space comes choice. You can evaluate the thought rather than obey it. You can examine it rather than be imprisoned by it. You can choose whether to act on it or to set it aside and proceed anyway. The second skill is interrogation. The mentally bulletproof do not accept the inner critic's pronouncements at face value. They subject them to the same scrutiny they would apply to any other claim that arrived without evidence. When the voice says you will fail, the interrogation begins. Is this fact or prediction? What evidence actually exists for this claim? What evidence exists against it? Have I survived failure before? What did I learn? What is the worst realistic outcome here? And am I capable of handling it? What would I tell a friend who came to me with this same fear? These questions are not rhetorical. They are genuine cognitive investigations. And they almost always reveal that the voice in your head is working with a fraction of the information available to your actual rational mind. The inner critic is not an analyst. It is an alarm system. And alarm systems, left unchecked, cry wolf constantly. The third, and perhaps most powerful skill in quieting the enemy within, is the practice of identity-based self-talk. Research by psychologist Ethan Kross at the University of Michigan has produced remarkable findings on the relationship between self-talk and performance under pressure. His studies demonstrated that people who speak to themselves in the third person using their own name or the pronoun you, rather than I, perform significantly better under stress, experience less emotional reactivity, and recover from setbacks more quickly than people who use first-person self-talk. When you shift from "I am scared" to "right now you are scared," something neurologically significant happens. The brain's self-referential processing center disengages slightly, and the mind is able to access the same clear, compassionate, strategic thinking it would apply to a friend in the same situation. You become your own coach rather than your own prosecutor. And a good coach does not tell you that you are broken. A good coach tells you what to do next. There is a fourth dimension to the work of silencing the inner enemy that goes deeper than cognitive technique. And it must be named directly. A significant portion of the negative inner voice is not spontaneously generated noise. It is the accumulated residue of external voices that were internalized over years: the criticism of parents, the cruelty of peers, the verdicts of teachers, the cultural messaging that told you who you were allowed to be and what you were allowed to want. At some point in every person's developmental history, the external critic became the internal one. The good news is that what was installed can be uninstalled, not overnight, and not without sustained, honest effort, but completely. Every time you catch the inner critic and refuse to accept its premise unchallenged, you are chipping away at its authority. Every time you choose to act in defiance of the fear it generates, you are proving to your nervous system that the verdict was wrong. Every repetition of that choice weakens the old neural pathway and strengthens the new one. And over time, through months and years of this daily practice, the voice diminishes not to silence, but to irrelevance. It speaks, and you notice it, and you keep going anyway. That is not the absence of the enemy. That is victory over it. Chapter 6. The Art of Discipline When Motivation Dies. Everyone starts with motivation. The gym is packed in January. The new journal is filled with careful, hopeful handwriting. The business plan is drafted in a single, inspired evening. The commitment is made with complete sincerity, backed by genuine feeling, announced with enthusiasm. And then, somewhere between 2 weeks and 2 months later, the feeling is gone. The alarm goes off, and the excitement that once made early mornings feel electric has been replaced by a dull, reluctant heaviness. The work that once felt meaningful now feels tedious. The goal that once seemed luminous now seems distant and abstract. And without the feeling to carry them forward, most people stop. They tell themselves they have lost motivation, that they need to find it again before they can continue, as though motivation were a key that had been misplaced, and the engine of progress cannot run without it. They wait. The waiting becomes stopping. The stopping becomes identity. And what was once a burning ambition quietly dies of neglect. Mourned, but not resurrected. Here is the truth that the mentally bulletproof have integrated at every level of how they operate. Motivation is a weather system, not a power source. It is atmospheric. It moves in. It creates conditions. And it moves on. And just as you would not build your entire capacity to function around the presence of good weather, you cannot build your capacity to perform around the presence of motivation. The people who consistently do what they say they will do, who show up every single day regardless of how they feel, who accumulate the kind of results that look from the outside like extraordinary talent or luck, those people are not more motivated than you. They have simply stopped requiring motivation to take action. They have replaced the question of, "How do I feel?" with the question of, "What time is it?" And when the answer is the time when the thing gets done, they do the thing. Full stop. This is discipline. And discipline is the most misunderstood word in the vocabulary of personal development. Most people experience discipline as a force applied from the outside, a constraint, a punishment, a grim, joyless alternative to living freely. They think of the disciplined person as someone who has white-knuckled their way through life, denying themselves pleasure, grinding through discomfort with clenched teeth and rigid self-contempt. That image of discipline is not only unattractive, it is neurologically unsustainable. Willpower, the conscious, effortful overriding of impulse, operates like a battery. Research by psychologist Roy Baumeister showed that willpower is a depletable resource, one that diminishes with each use throughout the course of a day. Trying to build your entire behavioral architecture on a foundation of conscious self-denial will work for a while and then collapse. Every single time, because you are working against your brain's natural economy. True discipline, the kind that creates permanent behavioral change rather than temporary white-knuckling, is built on a completely different mechanism. It is built on systems, identity, and environment design, three forces that operate largely below the level of conscious willpower, and therefore do not drain the battery in the same way. Let's examine each of them precisely. Because understanding the distinction between effortful self-control and sustainable discipline is one of the most practically important things you can learn on the path to an unbreakable mind. Systems are the architecture of automatic behavior. Every action you take with consistency is underpinned by a system, a set of cues, contexts, and sequences that your brain has learned to associate with the initiation of that action. The problem is that most people have not designed their systems intentionally. Their systems have been assembled by default by the accumulated pattern of their habitual choices over years. And many of those default systems work directly against the person they are trying to become. When you wake up and the first thing your hand reaches for is your phone, that is a system. When stress arrives, and your first response is to reach for food or alcohol or entertainment, that is a system. When you sit down to work, and within 4 minutes, you have opened a browser tab with no conscious decision to do so, that is a system. What the discipline masters have done, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through trial and error, is redesign their systems so that the easiest, most frictionless path available to them is the one that serves their goals. They put the running shoes next to the bed. They remove the apps that consume time without value. They structure their environment so that the default action, the thing that happens when willpower is low and decision-making is compromised, is still the right action. This is not cheating. This is intelligence applied to the architecture of behavior. Identity is the deeper engine. Research by James Clear, drawing on decades of behavioral psychology, has made a compelling case that the most durable form of behavior change is not outcome-based, it is identity-based. When the goal is to run a marathon, the frame is, I want to run a marathon. And every day of training that doesn't feel like progress is experienced as a failure. But when the frame is, I am a runner, every training session, however modest, is an expression of who you already are, rather than a down payment on who you hope to become. That shift seems subtle. Its consequences are enormous. Because identity is not just a thought, it is a filtering mechanism that the brain uses to evaluate decisions. When faced with a choice that conflicts with a deeply held identity, the brain generates dissonance, an uncomfortable sense of misalignment that motivates behavior change. Eat the thing that contradicts who you believe yourself to be. And the dissonance is the discipline. It happens automatically. No willpower required. Environment design is the most underrated tool in the entire discipline toolkit. Human behavior is profoundly, almost embarrassingly, shaped by the immediate physical and social environment. Studies in behavioral economics have repeatedly demonstrated that the choices people make about food, about exercise, about work, about leisure are more powerfully influenced by the arrangement of their environment than by their conscious intentions. Change the environment, and you change the behavior, almost without trying. The mentally bulletproof apply this principle aggressively and without apology. They remove the things that tempt them away from their commitments and install the things that pull them toward those commitments. They choose their social environment with the understanding that the people around them do not just influence their thinking, they establish the behavioral norm against which the brain unconsciously calibrates what is reasonable, achievable, and acceptable. To become mentally unbreakable, one of the most powerful decisions you can make is to place yourself in environments where the level of discipline you are trying to develop is simply the standard, not the exception, not the extreme, but the flaw. When you combine intentional systems with identity-level self-concept and an environment engineered for your goals, something remarkable happens. The doing becomes effortless, not because it is easy, but because the friction has been removed from the right path, and the alternative has become the hard one. This is what consistently disciplined people have figured out. They are not stronger than you, in some mystical sense. They are smarter about the conditions under which human behavior actually operates. Chapter 7. How to fail forward and rise faster than anyone. Failure is going to happen to you. It has already happened to you. And if you are living any version of a life that involves reaching for anything meaningful, it is going to happen to you again and again and again. This is not pessimism. It is the most honest and therefore most useful thing that can be said about the relationship between ambition and reality. Every person who has ever built anything of substance, every entrepreneur who has created a company, every athlete who has won a championship, every artist who has produced work that moves people, every leader who has changed the culture of an organization has a history of failure that is at least as long as their history of success, usually longer. The failure was not the obstacle to their success. In most cases, it was the prerequisite. What separates the people who use failure as fuel from the people who are destroyed by it is not the nature of the failure itself. The business that collapsed, the relationship that ended, the performance that missed the mark objectively, those events are neutral. They are things that happened. The difference lives entirely in what happens inside the person after they happen, and specifically in three variables that the mentally bulletproof have learned to control: the story they tell about the failure, the speed at which they process it, and the precision with which they extract what it taught them before moving forward. The story is everything. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We do not experience events as raw data. We experience them through the narratives we construct around them. And those narratives determine the emotional and behavioral consequences of the event, far more than the event itself. When failure arrives, the brain immediately begins building a story about what happened. And if you are not deliberately, consciously authoring that story, the brain's default system will write it for you, and its default story about failure is almost always catastrophic. The default story says, this failure is permanent, not temporary. It says, this failure is pervasive, affecting everything about who I am, not specific to a single context or decision. And it says this failure is personal, a reflection of my fundamental inadequacy as a human being, not the result of a flawed strategy or insufficient information or circumstances outside my control. Psychologist Martin Seligman identified these three dimensions: permanence, pervasiveness, and personalization as the defining features of what he called learned helplessness, the cognitive pattern that turns a setback into an identity, a temporary defeat into a permanent surrender. The mentally bulletproof write a different story. Not a delusional one, not a story that pretends the failure didn't hurt or that the consequences weren't real, but an accurate one. An accurate story about failure acknowledges the pain while insisting on its temporariness. It locates the failure in the specific decision, strategy, or circumstance rather than in the core of the self. It maintains the distinction between I failed at this and I am a failure, because those two statements are not the same sentence. One describes an event, the other describes an identity, and you have full authority over which sentence you allow to take root. The mentally bulletproof exercise that authority every single time. The second variable is processing speed. There is an optimal window for metabolizing failure, one that is neither premature nor prolonged. Moving on from failure too quickly, without feeling the disappointment honestly and fully, produces what psychologists call unprocessed grief. It goes underground, where it does not disappear but instead resurfaces in unpredictable and often destructive ways, as bitterness, as cynicism, as risk aversion so powerful it prevents any further meaningful attempt. The person who says, "Failure doesn't affect me," and rushes back into action before the lesson has been felt, is not mentally tough. They are emotionally defended in a way that will eventually cost them dearly, but staying in the failure too long is equally damaging. Grief that is not metabolized becomes rumination. The cognitive loop of replaying what went wrong, re-experiencing the pain, magnifying the shame, and rehearsing catastrophic futures. Rumination has been identified in clinical research as one of the strongest predictors of depression. It does not solve the problem it circles, it amplifies it. The mentally bulletproof have learned to give failure its due, to feel it with full honesty, to sit in the discomfort of disappointment without escaping it, and then to set a deliberate internal limit, to say, "I have felt this, I will not deny it, and now I am going to do something constructive with it." Because continued feeling without action serves nothing and no one, least of all me. The third variable is precision of extraction. Failure is only as valuable as the lesson it produces, and extracting a precise, actionable lesson from failure requires something most people in the aftermath of a setback are not resourced to do: honest, non-defensive investigation. Most people, when they review their failures, do so with a bias that psychologists call self-serving attribution, unconsciously assigning the blame for failure to external factors and preserving the positive self-image at the expense of accurate learning. They were unlucky. The market was wrong. People didn't appreciate what they had to offer. Sometimes these explanations contain truth. Often they contain just enough truth to make the deeper, more actionable analysis unnecessary. And so the same mistakes are made again and again in slightly different contexts, with the same avoidable outcomes. The mentally bulletproof conduct post-failure analyses the way elite military units conduct after-action reviews, without ego, without defense, and with the sole objective of extracting the truth. What actually happened? What did I do that contributed to this outcome? What did I fail to do that would have changed it? What information did I have that I didn't use? What information did I not have that I should have sought? What would I do differently, specifically and concretely, if I could begin again? These questions are uncomfortable. They require a degree of intellectual honesty that most people find genuinely difficult, especially in the raw aftermath of something painful. But the answers to those questions are worth more than any motivational framework ever invented, because they are your specific, personal, precise guide to not arriving at the same destination twice. The rise after failure, when it is done with this level of intentionality, is not just a recovery to the previous baseline, it is an ascent above it. Every failure navigated with honesty, processed with appropriate speed, and mined with precision, makes you more capable, more accurate, more self-aware, and more resilient than you were before it happened. This is what it means to fail forward. Not to pretend falling didn't happen, but to rise from the floor carrying something you didn't have when you were standing. Chapter 8. The Power of Controlled Focus in a Distracted World. You live inside the most sophisticated distraction machine ever built. Every device in your hand, every platform on your screen, every notification that interrupts the flow of your thought has been engineered by some of the most intelligent people on the planet. People with advanced degrees in human psychology, behavioral economics, and persuasive technology design, whose primary professional objective is to capture and hold your attention for as long as possible. And they are extraordinarily good at their jobs. The average person now checks their phone over 90 times per day. Studies of knowledge workers show that after a significant interruption, it takes an average of 23 minutes to fully return to the cognitive depth that existed before the interruption. And the compounding effect of this constant fragmentation, this endless interruption and reorientation of attention, is not just a productivity problem, it is a mental toughness problem. Because a mind that has never learned to hold a single thought under sustained pressure is a mind that will fold the moment that thought becomes difficult. Focus is not a setting on your brain that you can adjust when the moment requires it. It is a trained capacity that either exists in you as a practice skill or does not exist at all. You do not get to coast through months of fractured, distracted, attention-surfing existence and then suddenly access deep, sustained, unbreakable concentration when the pressure is real and the stakes are high. The mind you bring to the moment of crisis is the mind you have been building all the days that came before it. And if those days have been spent in the shallow waters of constant stimulation and perpetual partial attention, then when the moment demands depth, you will find that you no longer have access to it. Controlled, focus the ability to direct and sustain your attention on a chosen object or task, despite the presence of competing stimuli and the pull of distraction, is one of the defining characteristics of the mentally bulletproof. It shows up in ways both large and small. It is the ability to remain fully present in a difficult conversation rather than retreating into your own defensive narrative. It is the ability to work on a complex problem for an uninterrupted hour without reaching for your phone. It is the ability to sit with an emotion long enough to understand it rather than immediately distracting yourself from it. It is the ability, in the highest pressure moments of performance, to narrow your entire conscious world to the single point of required action. Athletes call this the zone. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called it flow. Whatever name you use, it is the product of a mind that has been trained to hold itself still in the presence of difficulty. And it is available to every human being who is willing to do the training. The neurological basis of focus is rooted in two systems that work in opposition. The default mode network is the brain's resting state, the system that activates when you are not deliberately directing your attention outward. It is the network of daydreaming, mind-wandering, rumination, and self-referential thought. It is always running in the background, and, in the absence of deliberate cognitive direction, it dominates. The task-positive network is the opposing system, the constellation of brain regions that activates when you are engaged in directed, goal-oriented cognitive activity. The problem with modern digital life is that it has been specifically designed to keep you in the default mode network surfing associations, following emotional triggers, consuming content, that is just interesting enough to prevent focus, but never demanding enough to require it. This keeps you in a permanent state of shallow engagement that feels productive but is neurologically identical to distraction. The mentally bulletproof have learned to deliberately activate the task-positive network through what cognitive scientists call intentional attention training, the practice of directing focus, noticing when it wanders, and returning it to the chosen point. Every single return is a repetition. It is a bicep curl for the prefrontal cortex. It is focus training happening in real time, available to every person at every moment of every day. The most powerful technology for developing controlled focus that human beings have discovered in recorded history is also the simplest and the least expensive: meditation. Not in the sense of spiritual ritual or religious practice, though it can encompass those things if that is meaningful to you, but in the purely functional sense of deliberately training the attentional system. The basic practice is nearly absurdly simple. You sit, you close your eyes, you direct your attention to the physical sensation of breathing, the air entering the nostrils, the chest or abdomen rising and falling. Your mind wanders. You notice that it has wandered. You return your attention to the breath. That's it. That is the entire practice. And the training happens not when the mind is still, but in the moment of return. Every time the mind wanders and you bring it back without judgment, you are performing one repetition of attentional training. Every repetition strengthens the neural circuits responsible for self-regulation, focus, and the ability to choose where your attention goes rather than having it pulled by the loudest stimulus in the environment. Beyond the formal practice of meditation, the mentally bulletproof build what could be called focus hygiene into the structure of their daily lives. A set of environmental and behavioral practices that protect the conditions under which sustained attention can flourish. They work in blocks of uninterrupted time, typically between 60 and 90 minutes. The approximate duration that research on ultradian rhythms suggests the brain can maintain peak cognitive performance before requiring a recovery period. They treat those blocks as inviolable appointments with the work that matters most. They remove, during those blocks, every technological affordance for distraction. The phone goes to another room, not face down on the desk, because the mere visible presence of a smartphone, even when it is face down and silent, has been shown in research to reduce available cognitive capacity simply by drawing a portion of attentional resources toward the effort of not picking it up. And they have developed what might be the most important focus habit of all. They have made peace with boredom. They have stopped treating the momentary absence of stimulation as a problem to be solved and started treating it as a condition to be inhabited. Because boredom is not emptiness. Boredom is the space in which the most creative, the most integrative, and the most original thinking a human being is capable of actually occurs. The mind that is never bored is a mind that is never genuinely original. It is always reacting, always processing incoming content, never still enough to generate something from within itself. The mentally bulletproof protect their boredom the way they protect their sleep, because they know that both are forms of cognitive recovery that modern life is systematically stealing, and both are essential to the kind of deep, sustained, original thinking that produces real results in a world full of people who have lost the ability to sit quietly with themselves for 5 uninterrupted minutes. Chapter 9. How to build unshakable confidence from the inside out. Confidence is the most counterfeited currency in human psychology. It is performed constantly and possessed rarely. You see it in the bravado of the person who talks the loudest in the room, who makes the biggest claims about what they are capable of, who projects certainty in every direction, and collapses the moment a genuine challenge tests the foundation beneath the performance. You see its absence in people who are extraordinarily capable, deeply knowledgeable, undeniably skilled, but who diminish themselves constantly, apologize for their existence, and hold themselves back from opportunities that should have been theirs, not because they lacked the ability, but because they could not make themselves believe in it. Both of these, the performance without substance and the substance without performance, are forms of the same fundamental misunderstanding about what confidence actually is and where it actually comes from. Real confidence is not a feeling. That is the first and most important thing you need to understand about it. Real confidence is not that warm, expansive sensation in your chest when everything is going well and you feel invincible and the world is confirming all your best stories about yourself. That sensation is real and it is pleasant, but it is not confidence. It is the emotional byproduct of favorable circumstances. Remove the favorable circumstances and the feeling disappears. Real confidence is something structural, not atmospheric. It is a settled, accurate assessment of your own capacity, specifically your capacity to handle whatever the situation presents. Not to be perfect, not to succeed immediately and without effort, but to face what is difficult, to remain functional under pressure, to learn what you need to learn, and to keep moving forward. That assessment is not based on how you feel in a given moment. It is based on evidence, the accumulated record of every hard thing you have moved through, every commitment you have kept, every time you chose action over avoidance and survived what awaited you on the other side. This is why the most reliable path to genuine confidence is not affirmation. It is action. Not because affirmation is worthless, we will address its proper role shortly, but because affirmations in the absence of supporting evidence are not accepted by the brain's reality testing systems as true. They are recognized as aspirations at best and as lies at worst. And the brain responds to them with a reflexive internal counter-argument that tends to be more persuasive than the affirmation itself. Tell yourself you are confident enough times with nothing behind it, and a quiet voice will continue to note, with uncomfortable accuracy, the specific ways in which the claim does not match the record. The brain is not easily fooled by its own cheerleading. Evidence is what the brain accepts. And evidence is built through the repetition of what researchers call mastery experiences, moments in which you set a challenge for yourself, engage with it fully, and succeed, however modestly, at navigating it. The mastery experience does not have to be grand. The first mastery experience in any domain is almost always modest, almost always imperfect, often messy and ungraceful, and full of obvious room for improvement. That is irrelevant to the confidence-building mechanism. What matters is not the scale of the victory, but the pattern it contributes to. Every time you do the hard thing, every time you make the call you were afraid to make, take the stage when your hands are shaking. Have the conversation you have been avoiding. Show up for the workout when your mind had already decided not to. You are depositing into a psychological account that will pay dividends at every future moment of pressure. You are building one experience at a time, an accurate internal record that says, when it was hard, I went forward. And that record is the only reliable foundation for the kind of confidence that does not evaporate when the conditions change. The role of posture, physiology, and non-verbal behavior in confidence is not, as some simplified presentations suggest, a trick to fool others. It is a biological feedback loop that influences your own neurological state in ways that are both real and measurable. Research by social psychologist Amy Cuddy and her colleagues, as well as subsequent work by researchers studying the bidirectionality of the mind-body relationship, has shown that physical posture influences hormonal expression, specifically the ratio of testosterone to cortisol, in ways that affect risk tolerance, stress, reactivity, and cognitive performance under pressure. When you inhabit a posture of openness and expansiveness, spine tall, shoulders back, breathing deep into the abdomen rather than high and shallow in the chest, you are not performing confidence. You are activating the physiological conditions under which confidence, consistent, cognitive states are most accessible to the brain. This is not manipulation. This is working with your biology rather than against it. There is a dimension of confidence that goes beyond the personal and enters the social, and the mentally bulletproof have a clear-eyed understanding of it. The confidence that other people see in you, the quality that draws them toward you, that makes them trust your judgment, that causes them to follow your lead, is not primarily communicated through what you say about yourself. It is communicated through your relationship with uncertainty. The person who can say, "I don't know, and I'm going to find out," without their sense of self being threatened by the admission, is more compelling and more trustworthy than the person who must always perform certainty to maintain the appearance of competence. The person who can receive criticism without collapsing or exploding, who can hold the critique in open hands, examine it for what is true, accept what is valid, and set aside what is not, all without needing approval or defensiveness to regulate their sense of worth, radiates a quality of psychological security that genuine confidence produces and no performance can replicate. The final piece of the confidence architecture is perhaps the most counterintuitive: the acceptance of incompetence. Every domain in which you want to build genuine confidence begins with a period of embarrassing incompetence. There is no way around it and no shortcut through it. Before you are good at anything, you are visibly, demonstrably not good at it. And the willingness to be publicly, uncomfortably not good at something for as long as it takes to become good at it, to remain in the beginner's state with curiosity rather than shame, with commitment rather than defensiveness, is the single most reliable predictor of the depth of mastery you will eventually reach. The mentally bulletproof do not protect their confidence by avoiding situations where they might look incompetent. They build their confidence by entering those situations willingly, persisting through the discomfort of early inadequacy, and watching themselves improve. That improvement is the confidence, not the absence of difficulty, the presence of growth. Chapter 10. Mastering Pressure: How to Perform at Your Best When It Matters Most. Every person has a version of themselves that exists under normal conditions, and a version that emerges under pressure. For most people, those two versions look nothing alike. The person who is articulate, composed, and fully capable in the rehearsal room becomes scattered and diminished the moment the stakes are real. The athlete who performs flawlessly in practice tightens and fails in the game. The professional who handles routine decisions with confidence and clarity freezes when the decision carries real consequences. This gap between who you are in practice and who you are under pressure is not a character flaw. It is a neurological reality, and like every neurological reality we have discussed in this audiobook, it is one that can be understood, worked with, and ultimately closed through deliberate practice. Pressure does one thing above all others to the human system. It activates threat perception. The brain reads the high-stakes situation, the job interview, the championship game, the critical presentation, the difficult negotiation as a potential source of danger. The danger of failure, of loss, of public humiliation, of social rejection, and in response to that perceived threat, it initiates the stress response, the same cascade of neurochemical and physiological changes that evolved to help your ancestors escape predators. Heart rate accelerates. Peripheral vision narrows. Attention becomes hypervigilant, scanning for threats rather than opening to possibility. Working memory capacity, the mental RAM that allows you to hold multiple pieces of information in mind simultaneously while performing a complex task, shrinks, sometimes dramatically. The irony is almost cruel. The moment when you most need your full cognitive resources is precisely the moment when your brain's survival system most aggressively withdraws them. Understanding this is not meant to discourage you. It is meant to free you from the additional pressure of believing that something has gone wrong when it happens. The nervousness before the big moment is not a sign of weakness. It is not evidence that you are not ready. It is your body doing exactly what it is designed to do in the presence of perceived threat. The question is not how to eliminate that response which you cannot, but how to work with it in a way that turns its energy into performance rather than paralysis. The first tool of the pressure master is reappraisal. Reappraisal is the cognitive act of changing the meaning you assign to a physiological state, not the state itself, but what you tell yourself it means. The physical experience of anxiety and the physical experience of excitement are, at the level of the body, nearly identical. Elevated heart rate, heightened arousal, increased alertness, sensation of energy moving through the system. What differs is only the story the mind has assigned to those sensations. Anxiety says the activation you feel is a warning, a signal that something dangerous is about to happen that you are not prepared to handle. Excitement says the same activation is preparation, your system revving up to perform at its highest level. Research by Harvard Business School professor Alison Wood Brooks has shown that the simple act of instructing yourself to view pre-performance arousal as excitement rather than anxiety produces measurably better performance outcomes across a wide range of tasks. Not because the physiology changes, because the meaning does. And, under pressure, meaning is everything. The second tool is process focus. One of the most consistent findings in the performance psychology literature is that performers choke under pressure when their attention shifts from process to outcome, from what they are doing to what is at stake. The golfer who has made the same putt 1,000 times in practice misses it in the tournament because instead of feeling the grip, sensing the alignment, and executing the stroke, which is the actual physical sequence that produces success, they are thinking about the score, the audience, the consequences of missing. The mental bandwidth devoted to outcome thinking is bandwidth stolen from the process that produces the outcome. The mentally bulletproof develop what sports psychologists call a performance cue system, a set of specific process-oriented words, phrases, or physical anchors that they return to the moment. Attention begins to drift toward outcome, not goals, not stakes, not consequences. Grip. Breathe. First step. the present action, the only thing that can actually be controlled. The third tool is pre-performance routine. Across decades of research on elite athletic and professional performance, one finding is remarkably consistent. Performers who use deliberate, personalized pre-performance routines demonstrate significantly more consistent outputs under pressure than those who don't. The routine is not superstition, though it is often mistaken for it from the outside. It is a neurological trigger, a sequence of behaviors that the brain has learned through repetition to associate with entering the optimal performance state. It could be a specific sequence of physical warm-up movements, a particular breathing pattern, a few minutes of specific mental imagery, a phrase or piece of music that reliably shifts the internal state. The content matters less than the consistency. The power of the routine comes from the fact that the brain, once it has made the association between the routine and the desired state, begins to enter that state automatically when the routine begins. The routine becomes a key, and the performance state becomes a door that opens reliably rather than one you must fight your way through every time. The fourth tool is outcome detachment. This is perhaps the most advanced and the most counterintuitive of all the pressure management skills, and it is the one most resistant to intellectual understanding without the deeper experiential work of the other chapters in this audiobook. Outcome detachment does not mean not caring about the result. The mentally bulletproof care intensely. It means understanding, at a level that goes below thought into something more like physical knowing, that your worth as a human being is not on the line when the outcome is uncertain, that your identity will remain intact whether the performance succeeds or fails, that you are playing to show what you can do rather than playing to prove that you deserve to exist. That distinction between performing from abundance and performing from fear is the most powerful internal shift available to a human being standing at the threshold of a high-stakes moment. And it cannot be manufactured in the moment of pressure. It must be built through all the daily disciplines of mental toughness that this audiobook describes: the morning rituals, the relationship with discomfort, the mastery experiences, the examined failures, the trained attention. All of it converges here, in the moment when it matters most, in the form of a person who is fully present, fully committed, and fully free of the need for a particular result in order to feel whole. That freedom is not indifference. It is the highest form of engagement. It is the state in which every resource you possess is available to the task, because nothing is being diverted to the management of ego threat. It is the state the greatest performers describe in the aftermath of their most extraordinary achievements as feeling effortless, not because the work was easy, but because they were entirely present inside it. No performance anxiety, no outcome obsession, just the full inhabiting of the moment and the action it required. That state is not a gift reserved for the naturally gifted. It is the product of a mind that has been built deliberately and daily to be unbreakable. Chapter 11. The discipline of emotional mastery. There is a version of strength that the world has long celebrated and persistently misunderstood, and it sounds like this: real strength means not letting things get to you. It means staying stone-faced in the presence of provocation. It means never letting anyone see you sweat, bleed, doubt, grieve, or break. It means building walls so high and so thick that nothing from the outside world can reach the interior. This version of strength has been passed down through cultures, through the unspoken codes of workplaces and families, through the models of leadership that most of us grew up watching. And it has produced an epidemic of people who are not emotionally strong but emotionally imprisoned people, who have confused the suppression of feeling with the mastery of it, and who are paying the price in the form of unexplained anxiety, inexplicable rage, broken relationships, and a chronic sense of inner deadness that no amount of external achievement can seem to fill. Emotional mastery is not the suppression of emotion. Let this be stated as plainly and emphatically as anything in this entire audiobook. Suppression is not strength. It is a strategy, and a costly one. When you suppress an emotion, when you push it down, refuse to acknowledge it, refuse to let it reach full expression, it does not disappear. Neuroscience is unambiguous on this point. Suppressed emotions are stored in the body. They elevate baseline cortisol levels. They keep the nervous system in a state of chronic low-grade activation that drains cognitive and physical resources 24 hours a day. They surface in distorted forms, as displaced anger that detonates at the wrong people over the wrong things, as physical illness that arrives with suspicious timing, as a numbness that slowly expands until the person finds themselves unable to feel the good things either. The person who never cries, never expresses fear, never admits vulnerability is not someone who has transcended emotion. They are someone who has learned to be afraid of it. And that fear is running them far more completely than any emotion they have managed to keep from view. Emotional mastery begins with a complete renegotiation of your relationship with feeling itself. Not with what you do about the feeling, but with what the feeling is allowed to be in the first place. The foundation of that renegotiation is what psychologists call emotional granularity, the ability to identify, name, and differentiate your emotional experiences with precision. Research by Lisa Feldman Barrett at Northeastern University has shown that people who can describe their emotional states with high specificity, who can distinguish between disappointment and grief, between anxiety and excitement, between anger and shame, demonstrate measurably better emotional regulation than people who experience all negative states as a single, undifferentiated mass of bad feeling. This is not a trivial finding. What it means is that the ability to name what you feel is not merely a journaling exercise or a soft skill. It is a neurological intervention. When you name an emotion accurately, you activate the prefrontal cortex's regulatory function. You reduce amygdala reactivity. You create the space between stimulus and response that Viktor Frankl described as the seat of human freedom. You go from being the emotion to having it, and that shift from being to having is the entire territory of emotional mastery. The second practice of emotional mastery is what therapists trained in somatic awareness call embodied processing, the practice of locating emotion in the body rather than only in the mind. Emotions are not just thoughts. They are physiological events with specific locations, textures, temperatures, and intensities in the physical body. Anxiety lives in the chest as a tightness, in the throat as a constriction, in the stomach as a hollow churning. Grief has weight, a physical heaviness that settles across the shoulders and behind the sternum. Anger generates heat, particularly in the face and the hands. When you learn to meet emotion at the level of the body, to locate it spatially, to observe its physical qualities with curiosity rather than aversion, something remarkable happens. The emotion, which in its unnamed, unacknowledged form can feel overwhelming and formless, becomes manageable. It has edges, it has a location, and things that have edges and locations can be held. The mentally bulletproof have learned to hold their emotions rather than be held by them. That distinction is the entire difference between emotional imprisonment and emotional mastery. The third practice is emotional regulation through the breath. Of all the levers available to a human being for influencing their own neurological state in real time, the breath is the most immediate, the most powerful, and the most universally accessible. The autonomic nervous system, which governs the stress response, is almost entirely automatic and involuntary with one critical exception: the breath. Breathing is the only autonomic function that you can deliberately control, and because of the intimate bidirectional relationship between the breath and the nervous system, deliberate control of the breath is direct control of the nervous system. When you slow the exhale, making it longer than the inhale, breathing out for twice as long as you breathe in, you activate the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system, the system responsible for calm, recovery, and restoration. Heart rate variability increases. Cortisol drops. The prefrontal cortex reasserts its authority over the amygdala. The state changes, not because the circumstances have changed, because you changed the signal your nervous system is receiving about whether it is safe to come down from high alert. This technique's slow, extended exhale breathing takes less than 90 seconds to produce measurable physiological change. It is available to you at any moment, in any context, at no cost. The mentally bulletproof use it constantly, not just in moments of acute crisis, but as a daily maintenance practice that keeps the nervous system calibrated toward regulation rather than reactivity. The fourth practice is emotional honesty in relationship. One of the most damaging myths in the culture of strength is that emotional vulnerability is a liability in interpersonal relationships, a sign of weakness that will be exploited, a crack in the armor that invites attack. The research on this is definitive, and it says the opposite. Vulnerability researcher Brené Brown's work across decades and thousands of research participants has consistently demonstrated that the willingness to be emotionally honest, to say, "I am scared, I need help, I don't have this figured out," is not a weakness in human connection. It is the mechanism of connection itself. People do not trust those who never show their humanity. They distrust them because the absence of vulnerability reads neurologically as inauthenticity, as performance, and the social brain is exquisitely calibrated to detect performance and respond to it with wariness. The person who is willing to be real is the person who is trusted. And the person who is trusted is the person with genuine influence, genuine alliance, and genuine support when difficulty arrives. Emotional honesty is not weakness. In the full context of a human life, it is one of the most strategically intelligent things you can practice. The fifth practice is the regular and deliberate processing of accumulated emotional residue. Just as physical training requires recovery periods in which the body repairs the micro-damage of exertion and builds back stronger, emotional functioning requires regular periods in which the accumulated emotional weight of living, the small frustrations, the unfinished conversations, the ambient anxieties, the low-grade grief of ordinary life is processed and released rather than compressed and stored. This is what quality sleep does when it is deep and uninterrupted. This is what genuine play does. This is what meaningful conversation does when you allow it to go somewhere real rather than staying perpetually at the surface. And this is what the practice of reflection, journaling, therapy, honest conversation with people you trust does with the consistency and intention of a daily discipline. The mentally bulletproof do not wait until they are overwhelmed to attend to their emotional world. They tend it the way an athlete tends to recovery, not as a sign that something has gone wrong, but as the indispensable maintenance that keeps performance sustainable over time. Chapter 12. How to build an unbreakable support system. No human being becomes mentally unbreakable alone. This is not a romantic notion or a consolation for those who find solitude difficult. It is a biological fact about the species you belong to. Homo sapiens evolved as a profoundly social organism, not as a creature that thrived through individual isolation and self-sufficiency, but as one that survived and dominated every environment it encountered through cooperation, collective intelligence, and the deep psychological safety of belonging to a group. The neural architecture that underlies everything we have discussed in this audiobook, the capacity to regulate emotion, to withstand stress, to maintain cognitive function under pressure, to recover from adversity, is exquisitely sensitive to the social environment in which it operates. When that environment is characterized by genuine connection, trust, and a sense of being known and valued, the nervous system operates in a fundamentally different mode than when it is characterized by isolation, loneliness, or social threat. And that difference is not peripheral to the project of mental toughness. It is central to it. The research on social connection and resilience is among the most consistent and most dramatic in all of psychology. Studies tracking individuals through significant adversity, the loss of a loved one, serious illness, financial collapse, combat, natural disaster, have repeatedly found that the single most powerful predictor of how well a person recovers is not their individual personality, not their intelligence, not their previous experience with difficulty, but the quality of their social support network. People embedded in communities of genuine care survive and recover at rates that dwarf those of equally capable people who are facing the same adversities in effective isolation. This is not because the people with support have an easier experience of the pain. It is because the presence of connection does something to the nervous system that nothing else can replicate. It activates the release of oxytocin, the neuropeptide associated with bonding and trust, which directly counteracts the physiological effects of cortisol. It signals to the ancient social brain that you are not alone in the threatening environment, and the social brain, processing this signal, reduces its threat alert level in ways that measurably improve cognitive function, emotional regulation, and decision-making capacity under stress. Building an unbreakable support system begins with a clear-eyed assessment of the relationships that currently exist in your life, not the number of them, but the quality. The size of your social network is almost entirely irrelevant to its function as a support system. What matters is depth, not breadth. 500 acquaintances provide far less neurological and psychological protection against adversity than 3 people who know you fully and stand by you unconditionally. The question you must ask honestly about each significant relationship in your life is not whether this person likes me or whether this interaction is pleasant. The question is whether this person knows who I actually am, my fears, my failures, my vulnerabilities, my ambitions, my doubts, and whether they remain present and engaged with all of that, not just with the curated, confident version I prefer to show the world. The relationships that provide genuine resilience are the ones in which you do not have to perform, in which you are permitted indeed, encouraged to be exactly as you are. Those relationships are rare. They require significant investment, and they are worth more to your long-term mental strength than almost any other asset you could cultivate. Equally important to the relationships you include in your support system is a ruthless clarity about the relationships that undermine it. Every person in your life is either contributing to your capacity for growth and resilience or diminishing it. This is not a judgment about those people's worth as human beings. It is an honest accounting of the effect their presence has on your nervous system, your self-belief, and your ability to function at the level you are capable of functioning at. The people who consistently leave you feeling diminished after interactions, who undercut your ambitions with veiled skepticism, who meet your vulnerability with judgment, who compete with your growth rather than celebrating it, who drain your energy without reciprocating investment, those people are not neutral presences in your life. They are costs, and the mentally bulletproof manage those costs with the same clear-eyed pragmatism they bring to every other domain of performance. This does not always mean severing relationships, but it means being deliberate about the level of access different people are granted to your interior world, and reserving the deepest access for those who have demonstrated they can be trusted with it. The third dimension of an unbreakable support system is mentorship, the deliberate cultivation of relationships with people who are ahead of you in domains where you are trying to grow. The value of mentorship in the development of mental toughness is not primarily informational. You can find information anywhere. The value is modeling, when you spend significant time in the presence of someone who has already developed the capacities you are working to build, who has already faced the kinds of adversity you are preparing for, who has already navigated the failures you are afraid of, who operates from a baseline of calm and effectiveness that you are working toward. Something happens in your brain that does not happen through information alone. Mirror neurons activate. The nervous system begins to entrain to the pattern of the person you are with. You begin to absorb not just their knowledge, but their way of being, the pace of their breathing, the steadiness of their eye contact, the quality of their attention. This is one of the reasons why the people around whom you choose to spend the most time have such a disproportionate influence on who you become. You are not just learning from them. You are literally, at the level of neurology, becoming like them. Building your support system also requires that you develop the ability to ask for help. This sounds simple. For many people, particularly those who have built their identity around self-sufficiency and competence, it is one of the most difficult things in this entire audiobook. Asking for help triggers the threat detection system for a very specific reason. It requires the admission of a gap, a limitation, an area where you are not yet sufficient. And if your sense of worth is dependent on always being sufficient, on always having the answer, always managing independently, always being the one who does not need, then asking for help feels existentially dangerous. It feels like an exposure that will cost you the respect and standing that your performance has earned. This fear is understandable, and it is also completely backward. The person who asks for help skillfully, who knows what they need, who knows who can provide it, and who asks directly and without excessive apology, is not displaying weakness. They are displaying self-knowledge, relational intelligence, and the practical wisdom that comes from understanding that no individual's resources are sufficient to navigate a complex world alone. The mentally bulletproof ask for help early, before the need becomes desperate, because they understand that getting the right support at the right moment is not a compromise of their strength, it is an expression of it. Chapter 13. The Long Game. Why Patience is the Ultimate Mental Strength. We live in a culture that has declared war on waiting. Everything around you has been optimized for immediacy. The answer arrives before the question has fully formed. The package appears at your door before you have had time to reconsider whether you needed it. The entertainment begins the instant the previous one ends without a moment of silence in between. This optimization of immediacy is not neutral. It is reshaping the architecture of human expectation at a fundamental level. And the expectation it is creating, the expectation that meaningful things should arrive quickly, that the gap between desire and fulfillment should be minimal, that discomfort and uncertainty are problems to be solved rather than phases to be inhabited, is one of the most corrosive forces at work against the development of genuine mental toughness. Because here is the truth that the culture of immediacy cannot accommodate. Everything that is truly worth having takes longer than you want it to take. The mastery of a skill, the building of a career, the deepening of a relationship, the development of a reputation, the transformation of a body, the healing of a wound, the cultivation of wisdom. None of these things yield to urgency. None of them respond to the demand for results on a timeline set by impatience. They have their own rhythms, their own internal timelines determined not by your schedule of wanting, but by the genuine requirements of the process. And the person who cannot make peace with those timelines, who abandons the process the moment it fails to produce visible results on a schedule that feels reasonable to their impatience, will spend their entire life beginning things and finishing nothing, covering enormous ground and arriving nowhere. Patience, properly understood, is not the passive experience of waiting with suppressed frustration. That is not patience. That is delayed frustration, which is simply impatience with a mask on. True patience is an active state, a settled, engaged, present-tense relationship with the process that allows you to invest fully in each day's work without being destabilized by the gap between where you are and where you intend to be. It requires trust. Trust that the process is working even when the results are not yet visible. It requires the maturity to hold a long time horizon in your mind simultaneously, with full engagement in the present moment. And it requires a relationship with uncertainty that most people never develop, because they have spent their lives trying to eliminate uncertainty rather than learning to inhabit it with equanimity. The neuroscience of patience reveals something important about why it is so difficult and why developing it is so valuable. The brain's reward circuitry, particularly the dopamine system, is heavily weighted toward the present. Immediate rewards produce stronger dopamine responses than delayed rewards of equal or even greater objective value. This is what behavioral economists call hyperbolic discounting. The tendency to value things in the present disproportionately relative to their value in the future. It is why a person will choose a smaller reward now over a larger reward later, even when they know intellectually that the math doesn't support the choice. It is why the pleasure of eating the dessert feels more compelling in the moment than the health benefits of declining it, even when the person's explicit stated values clearly favor the health. The pull toward the immediate is not a failure of rationality. It is a feature of the human reward system, and it operates largely below conscious control. Developing patience means, in practical neurological terms, strengthening the prefrontal cortex's capacity to override the reward system's preference for the immediate, to hold the future in mind with enough vividness and emotional weight that it can compete with the pull of the present. This is trainable. It is exactly the kind of top-down cognitive control that the practices described throughout this audiobook meditation. Discomfort exposure, deferred gratification exercises are building every day. One of the most powerful practices for developing the patience required by the long game is the deliberate cultivation of what might be called process love. A genuine, felt appreciation for the work itself, independent of the results it produces. This sounds idealistic until you examine what it actually means in practice. The person who only values their work for the outcomes it produces is at the mercy of those outcomes. On the days when the outcome is visible and positive, they feel good. On the days when the outcome is distant, invisible, or disappointing, they feel bad. And the bad feeling becomes a reason to question whether the work is worth continuing. Their motivation is entirely dependent on external feedback, which is by nature irregular, delayed, and often inaccurate as a measure of genuine progress. The person who has developed process love is insulated from this vulnerability. They find genuine satisfaction in the execution of the work itself, in the precision of the practice, in the small improvements that only they can see, in the feeling of engaged effort that the work produces regardless of what it ultimately yields. This is not a technique for ignoring outcomes. It is a way of ensuring that the daily investment continues regardless of the pace of visible return, which is the only way that any long-term project is actually completed. The long game also requires a specific kind of courage that is rarely discussed, but critically important: the courage of consistency in the absence of recognition. Most people receive social validation for short-term, visible actions. The dramatic gesture, the impressive performance, the announcement of a new beginning. What receives far less external recognition, and what is therefore far more difficult to sustain, is the quiet, unglamorous, daily maintenance of commitments whose payoff will not be visible for months or years. Nobody applauds the 1,000th day of the habit. Nobody celebrates the 10,000th repetition of the practice. The compound interest of daily discipline accumulates in private, invisible to everyone, including often to the person doing the work. And it is precisely because it happens in private, without applause, without confirmation that the effort is registering, that continuing it requires a level of internal validation that most people have never developed. The mentally bulletproof have learned to be their own witnesses, to recognize their own consistency, to draw their sense of progress not from external confirmation, but from their own honest accounting of whether they are showing up day after day for the work that matters. That internal witness, that self-honoring relationship with your own commitment, is one of the most powerful capacities a human being can develop. And it is built, like every other capacity in this audiobook, through practice. Chapter 14. Adversity as Architecture: How Hardship Builds Who You Become. The most important question you will ever ask about a difficult period in your life is not "Why did this happen to me?" That question, however understandable, however human, leads in one direction and one direction only: toward victimhood, toward resentment, toward a permanent position of being acted upon by a universe that either doesn't care about you or actively wishes you harm. Neither of those conclusions serves you. Neither of them is even accurate. But they are the conclusions that the unanswered question invites. And once they take root, they are extraordinarily difficult to dislodge. The question that changes everything, the question that the mentally bulletproof have learned to ask instead, is a different one entirely. Not, why did this happen to me? But what is this making me? The science of post-traumatic growth, a field that emerged from the pioneering research of psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun in the 1990s, and has since been replicated and expanded across dozens of research, contexts, documents, one of the most profound and counterintuitive findings in the entire psychology of human experience. Adversity, under the right conditions, does not merely leave people intact. It transforms them, not in spite of the difficulty, but through it. Tedeschi and Calhoun's research found that a significant proportion of people who had experienced severe adversity, serious illness, bereavement, trauma, major loss reported meaningful, positive, psychological changes as a result of that experience. Not in addition to the suffering, because of it. They reported increased personal strength, a deeper sense of the possibilities available in their lives, richer and more authentic relationships, a greater appreciation for life, and a more developed spiritual or philosophical framework for understanding their existence. They had not just survived what broke them, they had become something their unbroken self could not have been. What determines whether adversity produces growth or produces only damage is not the nature or severity of the adversity itself. Research has found post-traumatic growth across an enormous range of circumstances, from the profoundly severe to the relatively modest. What matters is the cognitive and emotional processing that occurs in its aftermath. Specifically, what matters is whether the person engages in what Tedeschi and Calhoun call deliberate rumination, a purposeful, meaning-seeking reflection on the experience as opposed to the involuntary, distress-generating rumination that simply replays the painful event without extracting understanding from it. Deliberate rumination asks, what has this changed in me? What has this revealed that I did not know before? What assumptions about life, about myself, about what matters, did this experience challenge or dissolve? What new capacities did surviving this demand from me? And which of those capacities am I now carrying forward? These questions are not asked once. They are revisited over time, with increasing depth and honesty, as the dust of the immediate experience settles and the longer-term implications become visible. This is not a comfortable process. It is often profoundly disorienting, because genuine adversity disrupts the fundamental assumptions we carry about how the world works and who we are within it. But that disruption, met with honest inquiry rather than defensive restoration of the old worldview, is the mechanism through which the new, stronger, more complex self is built. The relationship between adversity and identity is perhaps the most important dimension of this entire chapter, and it must be handled with both honesty and care. There is a version of the adversity as growth narrative that can become toxic when it is applied too quickly or too glibly, the version that demands that you immediately reframe your suffering as a gift, that insists you must be grateful for the hardship before you have even fully processed the pain, that performs resilience before it has actually been forged. That version is not what is being described here. Genuine growth through adversity requires genuine encounter with the adversity, full contact with the pain, the grief, the fear, the disorientation, no shortcuts, no bypasses. The transformation that post-traumatic growth describes is not available to those who skip the suffering. It is available only to those who go through it, who allow it to fully register, who give it the time and attention and honest emotional engagement that genuine difficulty deserves, and who then, from the other side of that full encounter, begin the deliberate work of meaning-making. One of the most practically powerful applications of the adversity as architecture principle is the practice of retrospective reframing, the habit of looking back at the most difficult periods of your life and systematically identifying what they built in you that you could not have built any other way. Not to minimize the difficulty, not to pretend it was worth it in some cosmic accounting, but to honestly recognize that the capabilities, the wisdom, the depth of character, and the specific empathy you now possess are, at least in part, the product of those experiences. The compassion you have for people in pain, where did that come from? The resilience you demonstrated in the last crisis, what did it draw on? The clarity you have about what actually matters, what cleared away the noise that used to obscure it. When you trace these qualities back to their origins, you will almost always find that they are rooted in difficulty, not in the comfortable periods, not in the seasons of easy success, in the moments when life demanded something from you that you were not sure you had, and you found it because you had to. That finding, that discovery of capacity under duress, is the architecture of character, and it is built exclusively through the willingness to remain engaged with hard things long enough for them to do their work. The final practice of adversity as architecture is perhaps the most quietly transformative. The decision to use your own hardship in the service of others. Every difficult thing you have navigated, every loss, every failure, every period of darkness, every moment of nearly breaking and choosing not to, is now a resource. Not just for your own strength, but for the strength of other people who are currently inside the experience you have already come through. The person who survived the addiction and who now sits with someone at the beginning of recovery. The entrepreneur who failed and built again, and who can now speak to the person in the middle of the collapse with authority that no textbook can provide. The parent who lost a child and who can hold the hand of another parent in that same darkness in a way that no one who hasn't been there can. When you give your hardship away in this form, when you allow it to become the basis of your most meaningful service to others, something remarkable happens. The suffering takes on a weight and a purpose that retrospective meaning-making alone cannot fully provide. It becomes the foundation of your contribution, and that transformation from victim of circumstance to instrument of healing for others in similar circumstances is one of the most complete forms of post-traumatic growth available to a human being. Chapter 15. Living the Bulletproof Mindset Every Single Day. Everything in this audiobook has been pointing toward this chapter. Not as a conclusion, because a conclusion suggests an ending. And the bulletproof mindset does not end. It is not a destination you arrive at and then rest in, finally and permanently safe from the demands of growth. It is a way of inhabiting every day a daily relationship with your own mind, your own behavior, your own choices, and your own response to everything the world presents. It is a practice. And like all practices, it must be renewed every single morning with the same intention and the same commitment that it was built with. Because the alternative is not to maintain your current level of mental strength. The alternative is to lose it. The mind that is not actively being strengthened is being passively weakened. There is no neutral position in the project of human development. You are either growing or declining, And the daily practice of the bulletproof mindset is simply the decision made every morning before the world has had its say, to be among the growing. What does that daily practice actually look like, assembled into a complete picture from everything that this audiobook has covered? It looks like this. You wake with intention. Before the phone, before the news, before any external input, you take ownership of your mind for the first moments of the day. You set your intention for who you are going to be today, not what you are going to accomplish, but who you are going to be. The quality of presence, the quality of engagement, the values you are going to embody in every interaction and every decision, regardless of what the day throws at you. This takes 5 minutes. It costs nothing. And it is the single most powerful investment of those 5 minutes that exists. You move your body. You honor the biological truth that the mind and body are one system, and that neglecting the body is neglecting the mind. You do not wait for motivation. You understand by now that motivation follows action, not the other way around. And you have stopped waiting for a feeling to initiate a behavior that you know is necessary. You move because movement is maintenance. It is neurological maintenance, hormonal maintenance, emotional maintenance, and cognitive maintenance, all accomplished simultaneously in the single act of using your body the way it was designed to be used. You do something difficult on purpose. Every day, before the day gets comfortable, you choose an encounter with discomfort that is controlled, deliberate, and intentional. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It has to be real. It has to be something that actually costs you something, some comfort, some ease, some preference for the path of least resistance. And it has to be chosen freely, without external compulsion, as a daily statement of your relationship with difficulty. That statement is not made once, it is made every day. Because the nervous system does not remember yesterday's victory for very long. It needs to be reminded, again and again, that you are the kind of person who moves toward hard things rather than away from them. The daily difficult act is that reminder. You protect your attention. You understand by now that your attention is the most valuable resource you possess, more valuable than your time, more valuable than your money, more valuable than your talent, because without it, none of those other resources can be deployed effectively. You protect it actively, not passively. You design your environment to support sustained focus. You limit the access that technology has to your cognitive space. You build periods of genuine, undistracted depth into every working day. And you defend those periods with the same seriousness you would defend any other critical resource. And you practice being fully present in whatever you are doing, not half present while the other half rehearses tomorrow's worries or yesterday's regrets, but fully, completely present in the immediate experience. That presence is not just a productivity strategy. It is the practice of being alive. You monitor the voice in your head without obeying it. You have learned to hear the inner critic without mistaking it for truth. You catch its pronouncements, examine them, and make a conscious choice about whether they deserve your compliance. Most of the time, they don't. And in the moments when they contain something worth attending to, when the voice is expressing a legitimate concern rather than a habitual fear, you extract the useful signal and act on it thoughtfully rather than reactively. You are the observer of your thoughts, not their prisoner. You practice this distinction every day because every day the voice has a new set of objections and your job is never finished. You invest in your relationships. You reach out. You check in. You show up. You ask how people actually are, and you wait for the real answer. You allow yourself to be known by the people who have earned that access. And you do not perform your strength at the expense of your humanity. You let people in, not indiscriminately, not without discernment, but genuinely in the way that creates the kind of connection that holds you steady when everything else is moving. You understand that the network of real relationships you are building is not a luxury or a social nicety. It is part of your resilience infrastructure. It is load-bearing. It matters. You process what happens to you. At the end of each day, or at whatever interval works for your life, you take time to reflect honestly on your experience, not to judge it, not to grade yourself, not to berate yourself for where you fell short, but to understand it. What worked today? What didn't? Where did I act from my values? And where did I act from my fear? What am I carrying that I need to put down before tomorrow? What am I grateful for that I might have rushed past without noticing? This practice of reflection is not self-indulgence. It is the cognitive and emotional processing that converts raw experience into wisdom. And without it, you simply accumulate experience without ever growing from it. And finally, and this is the one that ties every other practice together into something coherent and sustainable, you renew your commitment to the long game. Every day, somewhere in the texture of your thinking, you remind yourself of what you are building and why. Not the tactics, not the daily to-do list, the larger architecture of the life you are constructing, the person you are in the process of becoming, the reasons that the discomfort is worth it, the discipline is worth it, the daily difficulty of doing all of this instead of the infinitely easier alternative of drifting is worth it. Because there will be days when none of the individual practices feel meaningful. Days when the morning ritual feels like going through motions. When the difficult thing feels pointless. When the voice in your head seems more convincing than usual and the long game seems too long and the bulletproof version of you seems further away than ever. On those days, and they will come, without exception, for every single person who has ever attempted to build something lasting in themselves, the only thing that carries you forward is the depth of your commitment to the why. Not the feeling of commitment, the decision of it. This is the secret the title of this audiobook promised you. Not a single technique or a single insight or a single transformative moment. The secret is that there is no secret. There is only the daily practice of choosing to be the person you are capable of being, in the face of every force, internal and external, that would prefer you to choose comfort, safety, smallness, and ease. The mentally unbreakable are not people to whom this choice comes easily. They are people who make the choice anyway, every day, regardless of how it feels. That is not a superpower. It is a decision, and it is available to you starting today, starting now, with the very next choice you make. Make it the right one, and then make the next one, and then the one after that. This is how an unbreakable mind is built, not in a single moment of transformation, but in the 10,000 ordinary moments where you chose to keep going when you could have stopped. You have everything you need. Now go build it.